Are you a beginner sewer and a book lover? If so, this is the sew along for you. Quilted book sleeves. Everyone loves them. They're perfect to make for yourself or to give away as gifts. So here's my sew along and I hope you enjoy it.
First, you want to cut out 2 pieces of your outer fabric 9 inches by 12 inches and the same out of wadding or batting, again 9 inches by 12 inches. Then you want to attach the outer pieces to your wadding. I like to use this spray that washes off and it just keeps everything in place, but you can also use pins or clips or whatever you find easiest for when you're quilting. If you've got one, then you can attach your quilting bar to your machine, or you can draw a line down the middle. We're just doing straight line quilting for this, 1 inch apart, but you can choose whichever pattern you like. You can do crisscross or different widths, whatever takes your fancy. Once you've quilted both sides, you then want to cut them to 8 inches by 11 inches and then cut 2 pieces of your lining fabric in the same size, 8 inches by 11 inches. You cut them bigger before you start quilting because you will have some shrinkage, so I always cut them down to the right size after I've done the quilting. So you should have 2 pieces of your quilted outer, 2 pieces of your lining. All of these are 8 inches by 11 inches. 1 button and 1 either hair tie or a piece of 3-inch elastic, whichever you find easier, and your label if you're going to be using one. If you're using a label, now's the time to attach it. I use one of these really handy glue pens. This one's by Prism, and I've put a link in my link tree to my Amazon store because so many people have asked me about it. But I just pop a bit of this glue on, it just washes and just kind of disappears after a while, and then you put it in place and it just keeps it nice and still when you're sewing so it doesn't move around and go wonky on you. And then I can sew it in place and it's all nice and neat. And now it's time to sew it all together. So you take your 2 outer pieces, place them right sides together, and then pin or clip down the left and right hand sides and the bottom. We're going to be keeping the top open. So I'm just sewing here with a 1/4 inch seam allowance down the right hand side, across the bottom and up the other side. If you've got one, you could use a walking foot, or I just use my normal foot and sometimes this crochet hook just to keep the wadding going underneath the foot more easily. Then before we turn it out, we're just going to clip those corners. Just be careful not to cut into the stitches, and that just means that when you turn it out, it sits more flat, and then I just trim off any kind of excess batting again to make it sit nice and flat when you turn it the right side out. Now for the fun bit, we get to turn it the right side out and just use your fingers and then maybe go in with a chopstick just to make sure those corners are nice and crisp. Okay, so set the outer piece to one side and then taking your 2 lining pieces of fabric, place them right sides together and clip or pin down the right, the left sides and along the bottom. But when we sew this time, we're going to leave a gap in that bottom because that's where you're going to turn the whole thing the right side out when you've sewn them all together. So starting at the top of the right hand side, as I say, a 1/4 inch seam allowance, we'll sew down the right hand side. Leave the needle in and lift up the press foot to pivot round that first corner and then sew along, stop where you made your line, have a gap of about maybe 3 or 4 inches and then start sewing again along, pivot and go up the left hand side and then stop. And then as you did with the outer pieces, just clip those corners, just make sure you don't cut into the stitches and just trim off any larger bits. Now, taking your hair tie, now some people sew this on before they sew the outer pieces together. You can, but I quite like doing it after I've sewn them together, just so I can make sure that I'm putting it right in the centre. So you just work out where the centre of your outer piece is along that top edge, and then just simply tack it in place on your sewing machine. Just make sure you're not sewing through both sides. You just want to be sewing on the one side that is attached to. And now we're on to the final bit. So taking your outer piece and your lining, you want to place the outer piece that you've turned the right side out into your lining piece, which is still the wrong side out, so that you've got your right sides facing each other. So that should make sense. Put that in. You might just need to wiggle it in a little bit. And then what you want to do is you want to line up the side seams first and clip those in place. Once you've done the side seams, then straighten it all out and clip the middle bit and then each side of it. So you've got all of that top edge of both sides clipped together nicely, and then we're going to head over to the sewing machine and sew them together. If you can, remove the table so that you can just place this over the arm of your sewing machine and then it'll just feed round so that you're not in any danger of sewing the 2 sides of the book sleeve together. And then again, sewing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, just back tacking at the beginning and at the end. You want to sew all the way around that top edge that you have just pinned together. So then you just want to trim off any loose threads, and you can clip off that excess bit of elastic off the top. And then what we're going to simply do is put our hands through into that hole that you left at the bottom of the lining, and we're going to turn the whole thing the right side out. Give it a good wiggle and poke your fingers back in through that hole so that all of the corners are pushed out nicely. Clip off any stray threads that you can see, and then turn all of that lining out and flatten it out with your fingers, poke into the corners and just flatten it out straight. And then where you left that hole, you just want to press that in, give it a good press with the iron. And then what we're going to do is, where that hole is, we're going to take it to the sewing machine, and just using a really small stitch, maybe a stitch length of 1.5, we'll just sew that hole closed. And we're on the final stretch. So take that lining and just press it into the outer and poke it in with the corners so that they're all sitting nice and flat inside. Give that a press, and you can clip this in place if you want to, but I just eyeball this one, and you're just going to top stitch all the way around the edge. So just a nice 1/4 inch seam allowance if you want, or you can do 1/8 inch if you're feeling particularly brave, and you just sew all the way around that top edge, and it just keeps the lining sat nicely inside the book sleeve for when you're using it. And the final thing to do is to sew on our button. So pull your elastic across and just work out where you want that button to sit. If you want to put a book in, you can at this time, just to make sure that it all fits nice and snugly. Mark it with your marker pen or a tailor's chalk, and then you just want to sew that button in place. And there you have your gorgeous quilted book sleeve that you can keep yourself or you can give as a gift. I hope you like my sew along. If you're enjoying these, do check out the other ones in my playlist. And if you're feeling really generous, you could buy me a coffee. There's a link for that too in my bio. Cheers!